Again. I'm Annabella Chen. I'm a current fourth year in the School of Architecture at the Cooper Union, and I'd like to welcome you all to another installment of the In Conversation lecture series. I guess I'll explain first a bit about the lecture series. So the In Conversation lectures are organized on the basis that, or on the belief that there's a need for discourse that equally involves faculty, students, and the greater community. So it is discussion-based. Today, Deanna Agrest and Lydia Kallipoliti are going to give two short presentations in response to the topic of the body in question. I'm going to list out some of Deanna and Lydia's accomplishments in their bios. They're very accomplished people, so you may have to bear with me for a moment. Deanna Agrest is an internationally renowned architect, well known for her pioneering approach to architecture and urbanism, developed both in practice and theory through work, writing, and pedagogy. Prior to teaching at Cooper, she taught full-time at Princeton University's School of Architecture and was the first female architect to teach there. She has also taught at Columbia, Yale, and abroad. She was a fellow at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies from 72 to 84, and is a founder and principal of Agrest and Gandelsonas Architects in New York. Deanna has been involved in the design and building of projects internationally, ranging from urban design projects and master plans, parks, civic and residential buildings, single-family houses, and interiors since 1970, many of which have received awards. Her work and writings have been widely published in journals and newspapers, including Lotus, Oppositions, Assemblage, Casabella, the New York Times, among many others. For today's event in particular, we're going to be focusing specifically on two of Deanna's writings, Architecture from Without, Body, Logic, and Sex, as well as The Return of the Repressed Nature. Once we begin, I'll write all the names of the texts in the chat shortly for anybody's reference. Lydia Kallipoliti is an architect, engineer, and scholar. She holds a diploma in architecture and engineering from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki and a Master of Science in Architecture Studies in Design and Building Technology from MIT, as well as a Master's of Arts and a PhD from Princeton University. Prior to teaching at the Cooper Union, Professor Kallipoliti has taught at Syracuse, Columbia GSAP, and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where she directed the MS ARC program. She is the author of more than 50 articles and research papers published in magazines and books, including Log, Domus, Volume, and the Cornell Journal of Architecture, among others. Her book, titled The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit, was a finalist for the Cornish Family Prize, and she herself is the recipient of several awards, including the Lawrence Anderson Award, Fulbright Scholarship, and the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, among others. Her research focuses on the intersection of architecture, technology, and environmental politics, and more particularly on recycling material experiments, theories of waste and reuse, as well as closed and self-reliant systems and urban environments. For today's event, we will be focusing on her writing titled Masters and Slaves, which was published on eFlux. So those are the bios. For today's event, both of the professors will be presenting, and that will be followed by a Q&A period led by two student moderators, fourth year student Chao An Nguyen, if she wants to wave. Maybe if you can see her wave, and thesis student Isaac Islas Cox, if he wants to wave as well. Yes, he's there. So there's a time and a place for the expert monologue, but this lecture is absolutely not it. So we encourage audience members to ask questions during the Q&A period or write them in the Zoom chat if you feel more comfortable doing that. So with that preamble done, time for the lecture you actually signed up to see. Deanna, whenever you're ready, you can start your presentation. And again, the topic is the body in question.
First, I first want to thank you for your introduction. I just want to make a little advertising, which is my latest book, published with Cooper Union, is Architecture of Nature, Nature of Architecture. It was published last year. So you're all very welcome to look at it or get it. So, and it's on Nature. And so having done that many years on nature, I went back to my old question of the body, which we're going to focus on today. So I'm going to share screen. Okay, so basically, although as Annabella mentioned in her introduction, that we're going to focus on my text, actually, both of them. One is part of my book, Architecture from Without, Theoretical Framings for Critical Practice. And within that book, there's a text that was my first, one of my very early pieces, which is Architecture from Without, Body, Logic, and Text. And so basically, I'm going to include that in what we're going to do today as a precedent, basically, for what I'm going to be showing. So I want to read this. Here you have, we can discuss this image later if anybody's interested in the transsexual operations of in architecture. Is you haven't, oh, I have a typo there. Okay, never mind. So we can discuss that later, but that's what I'm going to focus on. But basically, in the body in question. So the subject of the body has deep roots in Western architecture. From the text of the Renaissance, reading of Vitruvius, we can fast forward to the culture of disembodiment, thought brought about as a result of cybernetics, information, and mediatization, and in the long stretch in between, all forms of architectural constructions of the body, as the most prominent being the modular Le Corbusier. But what body is the body in question? The question is that of difference, as opposed to universalization of an abstract male body. Differences of all kinds, which touch on the most profound forces that travel through the fluids and synapses, traversing the whole body in billions of possible routes, rhythms, and outcomes, each unique, each affected, if not completely determined, by sociopolitical, economic, cultural, and ideological environments, and enacted in diverse places and modes of habitation, and the modes of physical or institutional control, or of the ever-increasing possible extensions of the body. Which brings us back to the question of what bodies are we talking about when we talk about the body? Many of these issues are at the core of the work that I'm going to show now from the body studio that I conducted in 2018 and 2019 in the graduate program, and a small selection here. So these are reference and presents that were shown to the students, from corsets to, you can see the pictures. I don't have to explain what they are. They're self-explanatory. And here we go, the title of the studio, which was Body Dynamics, Corporeal Boundaries, and Spatial Intersections, focus on the body per se itself, not necessarily with architecture or in architecture, and also focused on issues of health, actually, before it was like Iflux or anybody else talking all the time about it as sickness. So this is a sumo wrestler, as seen by the student, and actually is a sumo wrestler who has a constructed body with fat for the purpose of the sport, has a terrible problem in getting back to normal life in retirement. So here's proposed a whole body prosthesis to help him readapt to normal life, because otherwise they live their lives in a horizontal, rolling from one place to another. Here is another one, which is called Inscriptions of the Body, Construction of the Geisha Identity by Li Tian Yin. Their names, you should be able to see their author's name there. And it's a most interesting thing because the geisha is two people in one. It is the person inside the geisha person. And that geisha person is an infantilized female body through the means of costume, super elaborate, enormous headpieces, and gesture, minimizing steps, etc., etc. So all of them have a lot more drawings and a lot more work, but I synthesize. Next is Confinement, Exposure, and Liberation of the Female Body, Fabric as Woman's Personal Space by Shamriti Sharma. And here we go from the corset, and she studied a lot of corsets and the modes of confining the female body for constructions that, as I said before, are political, ideological, and restrictive. And so liberating the body, wrapping and unwrapping, and she created through the sari originally a fabric that is rolled up. I put this her installation photograph there, where she made a film of which there's an image down at the bottom of a fellow student wrapping and unwrapping herself in many different possible forms with total freedom during this process. Next is Gravity, Time and Space in Karateka, the Virtual Space of Bodies Interaction by Yin Ling Guan. And these extraordinary drawings are some of the many of the process of the virtual space created by this martial arts origin, which is commonly called karateka, and the virtual space, the trace of which are in one of these which appears to be a model, which is a drawing, and the proposed space that reflects actually on what in fact the horizontal plane seems to do in these virtual movements. In this one, which is called Transformations of the Body in Reproduction by Farnoosh Farmer, as you can see, it is the female body in reproduction. And this was an extraordinary thing because actually what I don't have in big here is a detail of the placenta, which is actually an organ that's created specifically by the body for the purpose of the reproduction, one body becoming two. As I call it, a body within the body. Sometimes you have a male body within the female body, actually, the most interesting occurrence that made me think why we have so many problems with men. And here you see a whole sequence of drawings of the transformation of the body up to the moment of delivery. They're quite extraordinary drawings and models, and there are more, but they're not here. The next one is Tai Chi Chuan's Philosophical Principles Enacted, Fields of Energy Absorption and Release by Lu Feng Hao, and that's the Tai Chi. And basically, it's based on a philosophical system on the dynamic relationship between yin and yang polarities, and enacted by the releasing and absorption of energy, which was originally part of a system for meditation, relaxation, and defense in martial arts. But that has become, of course, a more common type of activity. I'm not sure if we call it sport. And these extraordinary drawings trace very accurately these fields of energy that are created for all the movements with the body. And on the left, upper left, you can see, if you can see the plan, which is actually there's many for each movement of the geometries of these complex movements in space. So these are very interesting because they don't require anything. It's just the body itself, but there's a virtuality to the space around it that is enacted by the movement and the system. And finally, Spacesuit Transforms by Xiao Zhao. And in this case, there's a study of spacesuits from the very early on, which, funnily enough, they started with women's underwear and the fabricators of women's underwear. And from that women's underwear that was developed into a spacesuit that was appropriate for the first very high altitude flights. This spacesuit developed in many incarnations and iterations that were studied. And in looking into all these relationships of fluids and circulation of how the body, its organs, the blood, including the vision, were transformed in outer space, and all the requirements for the different types of suits, then she came to the realization, in fact, there are all the elements for the life and the possibility of generating in the engendering of life. And so here you have the spacesuits, and you have the two, male and female, carrier of the artificial worms. And with that, I leave the space to my very respected Lydia Kallipoliti. Okay, now I stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you so much to the students that invited me to share some thoughts. And I'm going to present today just a series of incomplete thoughts. And I'm very, very honored to be in conversation with Diana, because not only because she's my esteemed senior colleague, but also because she is somebody that I have read and studied very carefully long before I had the privilege of being your colleague at the Cooper Union. So I'm very thankful to both Diana and the students for this invitation. So I'm going to start sharing my screen with you. And I was asked by one of the student moderators to delve into my origins, my primordial origins, and certain themes that are very, very dear to me relating to Greek mythology, but I haven't really had the chance to discuss in a kind of public debate. And I'm going to start by a myth about Eros, one of my favorite texts, Plato's Symposium and the quest for Eros, which is slightly different than love. It has entrenched within it this notion, the feeling of desperation, of longing, of incompletion and desire. And I'm going to start with a myth that I started in opening up my text, Masters and Slave, at Efflux a few years ago. So when Aristophanes was called in the conversation in Plato's Symposium to speak of what Eros was, he spoke of the root of human nature, and he referenced a bodily reality of three sexes, the male, the female, and the vanished male-female. In Greek, this would be arseniko-thylliko, which is at the same time simultaneously man and female, but also other kind of identities. The latter, the male-female, and these are some representations. There are very few representations of the male-female. It's very hard for painters, sculptors to imagine what that would be like based on the verbal text. But it was the fastest and strongest of all beings, according to the reference, combining both male and female attributes. Its appearance was whole and round, unlike what you're seeing on the screen. It was described as a full sphere with 4 hands and legs, 2 faces and a back on all sides. So it was not erect, which is not what you're seeing on the screen. This is a fairly misguided representation, and it would not stand up vertical to the earth. In fact, it would tumble down a slope, like a spherical shape. Its power of completeness became a threat to the gods, so Zeus invented a machine destined not to eliminate the third sex, but to fade its supremacy. He sent a lightning bolt to split the sex. As soon as the creature was fractured, and this is from pottery, from the representation of Aristophanes' myth in pottery, the desire for reunification, as long as it was split, was greater than hunger or survival. So according to Aristophanes, Eros was inherent to human nature as the tormented journey for reunion of original descent. Eros attempts to make the two more than one and thus remedy the original shortcoming of each as a split symbol. Aristophanes' duality was later displaced in the Symposium by Diotima's version of Eros, which was narrated by Socrates, as a multidimensional diaspora of the body in fragments, a fractured ego looking not simply for the other, for one other piece, but for pieces of one's own body. Following this, it becomes evident that Eros is as much directed to the other as it is to the self of one's body. It narrates an erotic desire stemming not merely from a longing of completion, but also from an intense desire to replicate the self, one's body and identity, to enlarge the self, and to prolong it to eternity. So based on that myth, I'm going to share a few thoughts which hopefully destabilize some of the very well-rooted canons of Western tradition as related to the body, and which has very much dominated the way that we relate the shape of bodies to buildings as a projection of harmony and equilibrium. And this is an argument that Diana Agrest makes very clearly and eloquently in her text, Architecture from Without. But also, let's see some of the arguments. So the first argument is that the origin in the myth is not the well-shaped man. And I'm using here Vitruvius' words, which were then used in Diana's text that I just referenced. And it has become, as we all know, the canon of Western tradition to understand geometry as a tool that shapes the character of what is normal, standard, desired, and projected as harmonious to architecture, nature, and buildings. Myths like the one presented here by Aristophanes were a dominant element of culture, also in pre-Socratic times. They were believed to emanate from the world's origins and intended to nourish the mind to conjecture its stature into the cosmos. Pre-Socratic philosophers believed that the body is inherently heterogeneous and cannot be examined as a complete construct. The Eleatics in particular, Parmenides and Melissos, sought to define that which could be homogeneous and concluded that whatever that might be, it can exist without a body. Even though the myth of Aristophanes well positions itself clearly within the Western tradition, we have the longing for completion and wholeness. We have a projection that wholeness is the desired state of being, as well as the binary opposition of duality that it fosters, the seeking of one male to the other female. The question of origin remains unresolved. The origin in the myth is not God, and it is not the well-shaped man, in the words of Vitruvius. The well-shaped body and its center, the navel or the omphalos in Greek, that has dominated perceptions of beauty, balance, and harmony, is displaced by eros, which takes shape in the indeterminate androgynous form. We can also think of geometry, and this is the image, right? Every image that references what architecture normalization might be, references the inscription of the body into the circle, an effort to normalize the body. And if we think psychoanalytically, the circle becomes the primary prosthetic of the human body that inaugurates its identification, directing desire to recognizable social norms that Jacques Lacan refers to as the law. Encirclement, therefore, implements a predetermined image to the body, one that guarantees totality. Thus, the body, as well as architecture and nature, is enclosed into a realm from which it cannot escape. Consequently, desire for aberration or deviation is framed. And of course, we know quite well that this image is not a product just of the Renaissance, but it is largely perpetuated by different traditions of the Enlightenment, different architectural traditions, not only by the modular, but here by Ernst Neufert, which has become almost the standard of measuring anything in architecture. This is of 1936. And then of different kinds of measurements, of book of measurements that have perpetuated the way in which we understand, measure, and take stock of the living world. In 1974, Henry Dreyfus and Associates, in their book of Man as a Measure, have included other kinds of bodies. So there is this kind of opening up of inclusivity of disabled bodies, elderly bodies, other bodies that are not necessarily well-shaped. But also it is very important within our times of longing for inclusivity to picture, to reference, and to project what these other bodies might be and how they institute new levels of measure and how they initiate different kinds of spaces. And this is an image from a French architecture student, Thomas Carpentier, in 2012 in his thesis. And this is an image of all possible inhabitants that could occupy space in different measurable ways that are not necessarily the kind of normatized bodies that we recall. Here I'm going to go into another hypothesis, which is not so much about inclusivity, but it is about self-love. And I'm going to get a little bit more technical here. The story of designing, editing, and replicating ourselves is as much a story of love as one of slavery. So in the myth, Eros becomes a drive for mobility, to complement the body and heal its defects. The desire then for supplement is inherently erotic by nature and is in fact deeply melancholic. The movement towards completion is desperate and non-stopping. In the myth, melancholy reflects the frustration of absence, devoid of wholeness. Then the search to find supplement bodies was a form of slavery in the journey of reconciliation with the origin. Desperation has many faces, and in the years following World War II, the desire to replicate the self via technology manifest into a series of anthropomorphic machines, one of which you see on the screen, under the contentious rubric master and slave. The term master and slave was mostly used to define a centralized communication protocol, one device or process the master would control all others, the slaves. The one that you see is called Yes Man. Yes, it's a real title. A master-slave anthropomorphic manipulator machine that was developed by American engineer Ralph Mosher at General Electric in 1956. The master-slave manipulator was designed to perform mechanical tasks in difficult radioactive areas and was built under a contract for General Electric's aircraft nuclear propulsion department. Besides being strong, the machine was also very dexterous, deft, and polite, helping this lady for Life magazine put on her coat. Along with that, Mosher pioneered a lot of different cybernetic anthropomorphic machines at General Electric between the 1950s and 1970s, including Handyman in 1958, a set of robotic arms controlled from a distance from an operator, these other kind of hands that are augmenting the capability of its own hands. This is actually NASA's prototype for a master-slave machine, a replicator of a body that would become its clone. And along with the augmented capabilities of different members, they have also developed Hardyman, which is what you see on the screen, this exoskeleton, and the pediculator, which was a walking truck that was very much tasked to look like an animal. Mosher developed several robotic prototypes with extra limbs that would directly be tied to the human nervous system rather than operate autonomously. He envisioned this kind of union as a kind of marriage, very much in the sense of looking for another body emanating from the myth. Our neurons translated desire into kinesis as a wedding of sorts. Man and machine were therefore bound in an intimate symbiotic unit that performed essentially as one system. The wedding was also consummated by a feature that was called force feedback. That meant that the person handling the machine could feel the pressure and the pain of his own actions redirected back onto the body. So the final hypothesis, and I'm very close to the end here, is that the master-slave model reflects and even materializes an absurdity of self-love. It is perhaps the truest version we have of human nature and its absence. Today, the legacy of human augmentation thrives in an enormous amount of research going into military and commercial applications of remotely controlled robots. This is Boston Dynamics' Big Dog, which is the most advanced robot that roams through a rough terrain with 4 legs that are articulated like an animal's, compliant elements to absorb shock and recycle energy from one step to the next. Recently, the MarkBot, created by Exponent Inc., was used lethally as a bomb disposal machine for the first time by US police to kill a suspected Dallas shooter. Considering today's ubiquity of different genres of machines and machine learning with big data and responsive systems, the master-slave devices exhibit little, if no computational intelligence, that is, intelligence exhibited by machines with a learning capacity. Although referenced as reconnaissance robots, Amazon's, and this is another version of the Big Dog, Amazon's flying drones that are expected to invade pervasively our skies, Big Dog and MarkBot are controlled by a master user in a linear chain of commands. Each master-slave machine might be limited in its operational intelligence, but as Benjamin Braden suggests, it is the vastness of their pervasion, spinning out on their own, that might in fact create an accidental global megastructure. Despite their differences, master-slave machines form a comprehensive understanding of the modern human condition, allowing us to witness how we safely reconstruct ourselves, believing in vain that the design is our own. Master and slave designs can partly be seen as the aspirational projection of a world based on connectivity, which was presumed with the emergent reality of digital information. The exhibit, the dead ends of our capitalist society, delusions of efficiency, flexibility, ubiquitous access to information, and totality. The replicate body of the master-slave envisions a world entirely based on mediation, both between individuals and with space. Our constantly connected existence allows us to affirm ourselves by augmenting our containment, simultaneously interiorizing and exteriorizing ourselves. Yet the passage requires a design of a replicate body and self, which is where our new communal with existence in public space occurs. Even though the master model reflects and even materializes an absurdity of self-love, it is perhaps the truest version we have of human nature and its absence. So thank you very much.
If you don't mind, I'd like to start off the Q&A by bringing up concepts from both readings. One of them that struck me from Diana's essay, Architecture from Without, was the idea of the shifter. And after I read it now, I can't help but seeing everything as a sort of shifter, with it being sort of in the Renaissance, the architects used it as a way to repress and assume the female body, where they become the makers of architecture, giving birth to designs. And I'm interested also in Lydia starting with the myth, where the idea starts at unifying a split whole, and it becomes the master-slave relationship of supplementing a body with self-love. And I'm interested, and I guess this is more towards Lydia, but I'd love the conversation to start with thinking about what a shifter means in this technological supplementation of the body. And I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Lydia. I loved your presentation, as I always do. And I always learn and enjoyed it enormously. And I took some notes, so including the shifter, but not because Lydia mentioned it, but because of the navel. And I do also want to, I miss thanking the students, which I do enormously. And it's such a pleasure to be here among my peers and in something organized by students and moderated by them. So highly appreciated. The shifter is a concept that I devised and developed very briefly while still a student in Paris. So that's a lifetime ago. But then it takes the rest of your life, you know, like everything, to do something with all of that. But it's one of those that I still like, and it's very useful. So basically the shifter is what allows you to switch, in my view, in my way of developing this concept, from one system of codes to another, from one code to another. In this case, it's a transformer, and or basically an possibility of an articulation. In this case, I use it here in what I call the transsexual operations in architecture, which I had the first image in my presentation as a reference to that text. And because students had asked me both to refer to as text and to my body studios, so I tried to bring them together in a very, very simple way. So basically, as following with the Renaissance reading of the Vitruvian text, and man as being the embodiment actually of both God, nature, and perfection, therefore, and all architecture being referenced from then on to this day to the male body. But here it is that both Filaretti and Di Giorgio Martino talk differently. They talk also about that, but on the other hand, the architect is put in the position of being a mother, the mother of the building, and care for it, nourish it, all the attributes that are present in reproduction, and assume that role, and also a father who's a client. And so basically it's acquiring motherhood, which actually motherhood is where the feminine is subsumed usually, both in philosophy and the popular imaginary. However, then you have projects where there's these fortresses that I portray there, where the text that accompanies them, which one also always has to read, talks about the location of the center in what is the central piazza and what is what gives where the architect as mother, what provides nourishment through the center, which is like a navel. Well, that's what hit me. The navel in the male body doesn't provide nourishing to anything. It is the trace and the absolute for life mark of being attached and coming out from the mother, a female body. And therefore I call this transsexual. It's not transgender, it is transsexual. It's appropriating what is unique to the female body as a sexual apparatus to attribute it to a male body directly, just like that, whoop, sleight of hand through this shifter. And it's that navel that does this thing. Now, I was very interested in looking again at the same image that I had used in the beginning, where I put together that image of male perfection and the embodiment of all that is architecture, and next to the same male body feminized, right? Holding like a baby, the building. And then of course, the fortress is where the navel is there in the plan. So actually when Lydia presented that image and the way she talked about in the circle made me think, and I made notes actually, that the navel there is the center, which makes like the circle being their womb, actually. It's like architecture, it's like giving birth to architecture, flat and geometrized, you know, so you could say, well, you could include that in the shifter. You give it one more layer, you know, where that is the navel again as a center of that geometry within which the body, perfect body, is enclosed, like a fetus in a womb. you know. So I thought it was, you know, it made me think that that I hadn't included in my development of this idea of the shifter there in this transsexual operation. This a kind of you know, it's a different type of, it's more like the Albertian type of operation of the measurements and the proportions and everything, as officer without you realizing, a very amazing operation in the text becomes the rules of architecture. In a certain way, in our unconscious, there it is again, you know. So that's my answer to Isaac's question. But I'm sure Lydia has a lot more to say on.
I'm not sure about that, Diana. I mean, I do have an observation based on what you were saying, but I don't know if that answers your question, Isaac, which you might want to, I'll make the observation and then you can probably rephrase your question, because honestly, I forgot what it was while Diana was speaking. But one of the things that was striking when you were speaking, Diana, to me was that in many ways, the navel, and by the way, in the Greek word, which is omphalos, referenced certain temples, certain locations were referenced as navels. So Delphi, the temple of Delphi, in different myths was referenced as a kind of omphalos. And there was, I mean, they didn't say that verbatim in the myth, but it was believed that there were topological irregularities in these places that that garnered different kinds of power. I don't know. I mean, in reality, we could talk about, if we use scientific terminology today, we could talk about magnetic fields and so forth. But they did reference of these places as places of topological irregularity in the omphalos. But when Vitruvius, and I did read your text, right? And you described very, very accurately that when Vitruvius analyzes the body using the encirclement and geometry as an abstraction, it becomes, there is a distance, right? Abstraction and geometry gives a certain distance from the body as a corporeal material entity. And immediately when that same entity, that same body part is referenced to the female body, it becomes a material visceral question related to nourishment, to the relationship of that part to the body, of how it feeds, how fluids flow in the body. So it renders a very different kind of projection of the body and of architecture, we might say, of not the body as abstracted via geometry, but a fusion of body and environment, of body and space, of body as materials. And we can think of, not machinic versions of the body as anatomy, but the body as a combustion device, as an operator of, temperatures, giving births, environmental conditions, and so forth, which is very much a condition that has been related to the female body and the way that it provides nourishment. So I just wanted to make that observation. I don't know if it answers anything, but maybe Isaac, you want to rephrase your question, and I'll be happy to try to respond.
Well, actually, it's fascinating that you make that observation, because what I was originally asking was considering or thinking about what could be a shifter in the technological sublimation, sorry, not sublimation, but supplementing of a body in that master-slave relationship. And what is the shifter that enables that supplementing was my original question. But what you bring up is a new dichotomy between an abstracted geometrical body and the corporeal, material, living body. And I find that also relating to this shifting in the supplementing of a technological body.
I see what you mean. That's very interesting. Would it be okay if I show you an image?
Please.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't planning to do that, but I think it's important to make a point. So that's the image. And this is something that I didn't include as a part of the reading. I wrote that, I think, more than a decade ago for log, and it was called Feedback Man. And I was thinking this image was called Feedback Man. It was produced by General Dynamics for NASA to understand the body as a combustion device. And it was something that was very captivating and was taken up by architects, Bucky, John McHale, a lot of architects in that time, especially AD, but also British underground architecture like Archigram. A lot of different magazines used that image. So it was fairly popular in a time when technology was instrumental in culture. Why? Because it shows a very, very different kind perception and a passage from modernist abstract space, from the passage of the body as a measure of the cosmos through abstraction, which is the Vitruvian Man, and later on Le Corbusier's modular, to a very measurable, and possibly maybe that's not good, but a measurable way of looking at the body as input and output. And that's also a very dry understanding of the body, but it was one that opened up other doors of environmental questions relative to what the body was. And I'm very enamored by this particular image. I just wanted to share that because it does speak of a kind of shift, speaking of shifters, of a shift between, of making something corporeal, of making space corporeal, which hasn't been before. It was always a projection of certain standards that projected onto space. So I just wanted to share that. I don't know if it answers your question, Isaac, but I think it's a kind of paradigm shift, maybe.
If I can jump in, if that's okay. When I was reading, well, so bear with me. There are a few things that I want to touch on, but I just would like to begin with talking about my interest in this notion of the symbolic order of architecture and how that being propagated through the male figures and proportions scenes in Le Modular or the Vitruvian Man sorts of exploits and negate the female body or the other sexes. And so with that symbolic order of architecture in mind, and with your exploration or discussion about the master and slave dynamic, I wonder if there is a shifter in within that master and slave dynamic that you bring up, whether or not it's a shifter that further reinforces the symbolic order of architecture, or it actually deconstructs and transforms that order in a way.
Can I just jump in a second before the answer? I think if you put symbolic order and shifter, we have a problem together.
Oh, I see.
Because there are different concepts that come from, address different issues. And so just to clarify, when I view symbolic order in the paragraph that Lydia liked so much about the ones excluded, which are placed in the symbolic order, right? In society, particularly the types of women, the not accepted, there's a symbolic order that society puts to them, but it's a construction that has to do more with psychoanalysis than, and symbolic aspects of ideology and politics. And so the shifters, it's a different concept, exploring questions of how meanings and culture is produced, looking into the codes that underlie the various cultural systems. So I would say they belong to different orders in the development of at least my discourse, and I use it actually, even if they're in the same place, they're addressing different issues. It's just a preemptive warning. So, but shifter is a very captivating concept, as I found out, where people always love it when it's presented. So, but I want just to make sure it's, it's not everything is the same.
I
So, but Lydia, you can take it up from there, actually.
The paragraph that I liked in Diana's text, I mean, there are many, but the one that we discussed is the one that spoke about the destabilization of the symbolic order. So the one that you say that certain bodies and the representation of these bodies are bringing forward a symbolic instability. And these bodies are odd, abnormal, perverse, neurotic, ecstatic, outsiders, witches, or hysterics, because they do not fit within the established symbolic order. And it's one of my favorite paragraph because it resonates within contemporary questions more than, well, maybe not more than ever, but very much so with questions that we're facing today. When we're asked to, one of the first thing that we're asked is to present these outliers that have been rejected because they have been considered forces of destabilization from architectural history, from canonical knowledge, from what we teach to students. And how that might happen, we know is a very, very difficult task and one that will take us a marathon. We haven't even started running the first 10 meters of. And I don't know if that answers your question in any way.
Oh, yeah. Well, there are many facets in which I'm still trying to understand, but I guess just to maybe simplify or make clearer or make more correct, I was wondering if the dynamic of master and slave being presented further reinforces the notion of the symbolic order or maybe deconstruct it or transform it in a way. If that, I wonder if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. And I mean, it's a very interesting, it's a very interesting dynamic. And obviously the term is extraordinarily contentious, right? It was banned from the state of California in 1995 to use the term slave to describe technological equipment. And it's a term that basically is egregious and is no longer used to reference such kinds of relationship between for man-machine integration. But one of the very, very interesting, when examining this archive, one of the very interesting things that I figured out was who was the slave? So the idea was when GE was doing the research in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s to provide devices that would complement, enhance, and augment the strength of the body, of the male masculine body, obviously, at that time, but also to create different kinds of attributes like being very dexterous, polite, and so forth. But the process of controlling that duplicate body was extraordinarily burdensome. So the person that would control the body, because of the feature of force feedback, the master was exhausted within about 10 minutes of operating the machine. And there are images, I showed just one of them, of the master being completely wiped out from trying to control the slave, kind of reversing the power, let's say, equilibrium between the master and the slave. And that's why I was interested in this, because it's not because I'm entirely disinterested in the leveraging of power to machines. And I find that extraordinarily contentious. But in a way, the slave is also the operator, the slave of his own desire to create another body, to create life from zero, and to kind of foster the identity of something that he can utterly control. And this is something that has resonances with contemporary culture in the way also that we edit our identities online, and we're so extraordinarily careful. It's a design process, right? The way that we present ourselves in an online medium, in a platform such as this, is a design process. And that was also a design process, but then the operator becomes a slave of his own making. And that's how I see this dichotomy and this debate unfolding. And that's what becomes interesting to me. It's the condition of being a slave to one's desire. There's a question in the chat. I don't know if you guys want to open it up to the public too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Should I read it out loud?
Or the person who, they can also say the question, whatever you want, guys. It's your moderating.
All right. Well, I think I'll go ahead and read it out loud. Diana, Lydia, do not objects, rooms, whole buildings also have bodies? And do they not address us? The conversation so far seems to me to give primacy to our own bodies, and this rather solipsistically. This is from Michael Benedict.
Well, I think that I think not being the direct issues, direct answers as to the architecture is a way to really penetrate more deeply into the question of the bodies themselves. I think that the questions that are raised in different ways about the bodies occupying space. For instance, in my presentation of my studios, 2 years, that's a long, many years in between my essay, which was published in 87, but I wrote that piece actually many, many, many years later, the essence of that piece, basically, which I developed later. And therein are many questions that deal with how we occupy. It's called corporeal boundaries and spatial intersections. And I think that the questions of what bodies can do in space, what is seen, what is not seen, what is seen is not seen or accepted fully or understood even in the body itself, whether it's cutting a section through the body, which is an architectural operation, by the way. Many of these things that are not thought about, like the generation of a new organ in the body, for reproduction. I think that's an important thing to consider when you're what I call the inherited ideologies that were mentioned in the very beginning, have us take architecture with principles that assume for a fact that the male body is the best generator for urban form. And secondly, an image I would have had, thank you, Lydia, for bringing it up. I took it out for the sake of making a presentation briefer, which was, of course, a modular and Neufert. Again, the male body, they are occupying the space measured as a point of reference. Absolute. We're going from the Renaissance, from before, actually, way before, we're talking Vitruvius, all the way to the 20th century. Has it changed? Is it changing? Does anybody refer to the female body as the ideal and generator of architecture space? No. Only metaphorically, only which is more than metaphoric in the text that I looked into, but of course there are many more, and ways of operating. So I think it's very much attached to, not so solipsistic, it's pretty direct. It's all written and printed. And we've been absorbing this for a very long time, both male and female, everybody, and everything in between, by the way. So to talk about these issues that are pervasive and important in our society today, going into the question, which is the body, both in its physicality and its as being a member of society, determined, influenced, etc., by it, and ideology in which bodies still are being repressed, erased, discriminated against, and I can talk about the female body, which is still erased, displaced, and discriminated against in many, many ways. It is in the architectural text, but it is in many other ways as well. Shouldn't we talk about that in architecture? When that's what we're doing. Do we have to accept the whole package as it comes, given to us? Or do we have a role as architects to think about our discourse and what is involved socially and what decisions we're making that have to do with how people inhabit those spaces that you mentioned? Yes, we inhabit spaces, body inhabits spaces. And when we talk about our bodies, it's not my body or Lydia's body, it is the body. And that body can take many different forms in every sense, from its own physicality with which it is born, or which also is determined by the conditions of how they're born, even genetic, to the modes of living in society to which we contribute as architects. So I think it's very much an issue that we should look into carefully, in detail. And I think in extremes is what I always thought, and I think maybe that's something I must have learned from somewhere, but I can't remember where. But in looking at extreme, I think I figured out in reading different things that looking at extremes, you understand what's a medium. If you just look at the direct or the medium, it's just pure, everything becomes an analogy. If you go to extreme, like you take the master and slave case, which is a bit of an extreme, a very scary actually creature, that one, that last one. And, or you take my last image of the womb, the artificial womb, which people have been dreaming about, generating bodies. Men have been dreaming about generating life forever. Well, here it is, they still will need some of the female genetic, and physical, biological attributes for that, maybe an egg or something like that, or that kind, who knows. But here it is, there's all these things. And all those things have implications for what we do. Include, for instance, you take the virtual spaces of whether it's the Tai Chi or the Karate, I found that fascinating. The energy that bodies transmit, the delivery of energy and the receiving energy. Now, don't we do that when we occupy space? Do we ever consider that? No. Do you ever consider bodies in movement all the time and how bodies move in space? No. So if you look at how they do in a case of this kind of activity, you learn something that you hadn't thought before about how we occupy space. And I could go on and on and on. So I don't know, in my view and my experience from studio, it's, when you look into something, people were free to, they could have attached it. Somebody did some object, which is very nice, but, I chose not to do that one, based on the movements from skateboarding and generate kind of a topological type space where you could continuously skateboard without having to do the jumps and this and that and so on. But I thought these were a little bit more evocative in the sense of what the issues were brought out. And I would say the same for Lydia's, looking at this man-machine relationship, where we're dealing with that constantly. I mean, first of all, we're dealing with machines in our production of architecture from the design desk, where somebody wrote a program that's already predetermining how we use it. There's an author behind the author of architecture, the programmer, the person who did that program, to the means of construction, right? Modes and means, as it's called in the contracts of construction. We deal with machines constantly to produce architecture. at every level. And then we deal with machines in our everyday life, occupying the place we inhabit. So how would the man machine and robotics not be part of architecture? So that's my answer to that question for now.
Lydia, would you like to chime in? I'd also like to say that there's Mr. David Lieberman would like to make a short critical comment, whichever works. Please let.
Yeah, I want to just very briefly say, very briefly, because Deanna couldn't have said it better with all of this extensive commentary, that I think that all the bodies, as Deanna pointed out, I'm just saying the same thing in different words, I guess. It has nothing to do with subjectivities of different kinds of subjectivities inhabiting certain kinds of spaces, but the body as a kind of abstract tabula rasa, which represents a certain time period, and the bodies that we have shown become parts of that symbolic order that Deanna explained in the text. So I think the discussion is about canons, order, but also about what these bodies, not the literal manifestation of each one of the examples, but the kind of reflection of what they mean in terms of the spaces they produce. And maybe we can pass on to the comment now, Isaac, if you, of David.
I wonder if I could respond just a little bit. This is Michael Benedict. Okay, so I enjoyed the presentation very much, but I would say that we're being a little bit solipsistic. The body is your body and mine. The body is the phenomenological center of the whole argument. And the image is that of a human being, male or female. I would agree that it's mostly male, is projected onto the world or interacts with the world. But what I find missing, and I wish was there more, was the sense that a lot of architects have that objects themselves have bodies and are looking at us. A chair, a table. I mean, I don't mean to bring triple O into to bear here, but there's a sense in which everything is experiencing us as well. And one of the things that architects are able to do through empathy, and artists and sculptors are able to do, is actually look at us through the objects we make. Like, is the building a mother? Is a building a father? Is a building looking at us? Is a building aggressive? Is a building shy? Is a building retiring? Is it a lie? Is it trying to be amusing? These are all characteristics that, true enough, we project on buildings, because buildings is just things. But actually there's a long tradition inside of humanism and also post-humanism to put eyes into objects and to let them look at us, and to use the logic of body and body experience to inhabit objects and spaces. I would love that perspective to be a part of this conversation.
Might I follow that? Is that all right, Isaac? Yeah, well, first, thank you, Diana. Thank you, Lydia. And in a way, to pick up on a couple of phrases within what Michael has just said, and bear with me, I'm just going to read a couple of short sentences from an old piece of mine. Our relation to the world has for so long been characterized by the Vitruvian man as drawn by Leonardo da Vinci, dimensioned, measured, and contained by the classic alchemical squaring of the circle. Matter, or mater, M-A-T-E-R, the model of our time, is the Persephonic woman, energy and light at the center of the pomegranate. Was it Eve, not the serpent, that offered Adam the forbidden fruit? And surely the fruit was a pomegranate, not an apple. The pomegranate, imperfect and yet complete, allowing for improvisation and difference, not necessitating Euclidean perfection or in turn Platonic correctness. more in keeping with the Pythagorean model of relational geometries and opportunity. The pomegranate with its innumerable seeds, a womb filled with eggs of the unborn, most of whom will never see the light of day, but they are certainly the children of woman, not yet the children of man, which points of clarity in a world of possibilities.
I like your text.
Well, it does have a Greek relationship in that it's part of a text that was included in a feature-length film I first screened at a music festival in Cyprus about 4 years ago. But that's an aside. Anyway.
Thank you for your comment.
Well, thank you for the provocation.
If Lydia would like to make any other comments, go ahead. But afterwards, we'll move on to a student question from TM, and then after that, we can tackle on more questions coming from the group chat section.
I appreciate your comments, Michael. I do think that if we think of objects as with vitality, and I am inclined to think, I appreciate very much Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, and I did read The Territory of OOO. But I think that, so I do appreciate it's not just a one-sided discourse of the body to space and the body as a metaphor, which is inscribed in certain kinds of systems, proportions, and what Diana has very well framed as symbolic order. But I think that if we think of this kind of exchange, we very quickly, what fears me is these metaphors that become deductive of space as mother, space as when these kinds of identities are inscribed in understanding a space through the exchange of a body with objects, it becomes another kind of forced identification as much as the circle becomes for Vitruvian man. And I think that this exchange between the body and the space and the object should be left open. I don't know if that becomes an answer, and it's a very, very long discussion because I have my own personal issues with OOO, which we can discuss in person at another occasion. But I do wish that there is a more, that the circle of the Vitruvian man is opened rather than becomes a kind of forceful measure of identification. And that's just a...
I don't want to be too identified with OOO. It's just that part of
you did mention it. I did not.
I did, but listen, it's all right. Never mind. A one-on-one discussion. But part of the opening of that circle that you referred to, and I'd also say the opening of the square that's inside the square, is opening yourself to the perspectives of inanimate objects, or sort of equalizing the playing field somewhat. And I think
it's a really important question.
Of falling into another orthodoxy. In fact, I would credit OOO with helping that orthodoxy be deconstructed somewhat.
I wish that would be the case, and I think that's the benefit. I do think that the inscription, the kind of inscription of the circle, is very similar to, if we think psychoanalytically, and I did reference Jacques Lacan's identification process or the mirror stage, which forces an identity onto a subject which hasn't really formed an identity. It is also a fact of, psychoanalytically, he would also argue for opening up the framework of reference from the circle to open it up. And that's why I'm very interested in ecological issues and issues of relational issues between bodies and spaces, how bodies react to environments and how they become part of these larger ambient atmospheric and environmental conditions rather than be inscribed within a fixed context. So I don't know if that becomes, but that exchange is something that that becomes.
No, I think that what you're saying represents real progress. That
Okay, I'm glad. I'm glad.
perhaps we can email back and forth.
Sorry, just to transition, get more space for more question. Maybe we should move on to TM, if that's okay.
That's fine. That's fine.
Thank you.
Of course.
Hi, thank you both for a very fascinating lecture and conversation. I was just particularly interested in this this mythology, Lydia, that you spoke on, which is this like man-woman conjoined creature, and how this creature was split out of fear of it becoming or it being too powerful. And I can't help but think of that then, that connection with sort of us as humankind today, having this relationship with technology, and how that half of our being is becoming more and more built into our everyday lives, but also into our own bodies, and how we're headed towards this direction of then becoming again this being of two halves, instead of man and woman, but just human and cybernetics. And I'm curious about how in the mythology, the two halves were separated out of fear of power, and how the sort of role of fear is into our striving towards that greater power today.
I'll answer it, but I do want Diana to take up on that question, because I think her input would be fascinating. I think you're absolutely right, TM. It's the myth in many ways is very naive, and in others it's extraordinarily current and prescient to conditions of longing that we have today, which are reflected not in the, let's say, naive search of a soulmate or of another half, but with all of the kind of supplemental technologies that inhabit our bodies, and they are a desire of reunification. In the myth, you should read it. It's actually amazingly fun to read that myth, and I'm sure you can get a PDF online. Because it was inscribed in the Western tradition and it's part of a kind of canon, it does argue for wholeness and dualism, which are two contested features of Western culture. But if you read it in different light, in the eyes of what is the journey of mobility of what we seek in as kind of incomplete bodies today, that journey of mobility is definitely not in all cases another body, but in many ways a replication and an editing of the self. And that's what was fascinating to me when looking at these like horrifying machines that scared Deanna, the master slave machines. But I'm hoping that I'm mentioning this in the text, which I will send you the link, or I will talk about to you in the seminar.
Well, I think that in a way, you know, the relationship between humans, I would say, and machines and through the body is as it's been, who was it, McLuhan, I think I think said every one of these machines are extension of our senses. You know, we've been having extension of our eyes, an extension of our ears, an extension of our touch, an extension of our movement capabilities, etc., through machines for centuries, if not forever. Because we're very limited as human bodies, actually, what we can do. I mean, a lot of beings in the animal kingdom can do many more things than us, excepting think, and then that's relative how well people think these days. So the point is, you know, and then there's this Donna Haraway, you know, the Cyborg Manifesto, which is already part of our everyday life, you know. And so I think in a way it's scary, and there's enough science fiction for that to happen, to get scared about. But on the other hand, I think it's the life we live in, because the fact that we have, when the quantum computer comes, there's no way you can catch up. There's no way our brains could operate. They can't operate in the speed of regular computer, of an old computer. So, the point is that we already live in it. We're in it. Are we afraid? I don't know. C'est la vie. You just, make your choices in it. You make your choices. You go for this, you don't go for that. You support this, you don't support that. In the end, it's a life choice, it's a political choice. But the thing is there to stay for now. So that would be my answer. Very simple.
Should we move on to the question in the chat then?
Question?
Yes, it says from Valerio Franzone. Hello, thanks to Diana and Lydia for the stimulating presentations. You talked about the female-male relation, the flesh-mechanical relation. It is all about humans. Considering this pandemic, which is the new paradigm created by the new relation, human, non-human, that the virus, and in parentheses, we're not sure if living or not, end parentheses, is establishing. Probably the paradigm is new because of our different and new consciousness, because pandemics, viruses, germs always existed. How can we characterize this paradigm considering the body? Thank you, Valerio.
Who wants to take that?
I love this question. I do. It's such a fascinating question. And thank you, Valerio, wherever you are in this grid. I think it's a very, very important question, but it's definitely one that was a pre-existing discussions. If you would ask me 2 years ago or 3 years ago, what was the kind of paradigm shift of the body image that would represent our times, it would not be, of course, Le Corbusier or the modular or the feedback man that was in the 60s and 70s, which was a kind of technological and techno-environmental body, but it would be the microbiome. The body as a kind of stellar microcolony of all of these microorganisms that inhabit our skin and flesh. And the realization, which was astonishing to medical practitioners, that within each subjectivity lies a universe that is unique to each one of us. So I think that image, that research was already before the pandemic very prevalent in medical research. And there was, in building technology circles, it was quite the case to understand how different environmental control systems would impact different kinds of bodies inhabiting spaces. Now, with the pandemic, we have a much enlarged realization of invisible entities from from aerosols, and all of the big newspapers right now. If you look at El País or the New York Times, they're trying to visualize aerosol transmission. And this is the new prolific field of research, right? How we become vectors of disease, how different kinds of spatial protocols are instituted because of that spread of the body becoming a spread. But I think that it's extraordinarily important to think of these questions of the non-human, the kind of bacteria, germs, all of these. And there's a wide literature, I would say, that speaks about these matters. If you think of my former advisors, Beatriz Colomina, not about X-ray architecture. She speaks of illness and bacteria inhabiting houses. There's Andrea Bagnata, who speaks of microscopic colonialism. And I try to speak of these things when I write as well. But I think it's definitely a pre-existing tendency, just like confinement was in many ways before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, there was a study that we spent as a civilization 90% of our time indoors. That was the Environmental Protection Agency in 2019, and it's a statistical research. And definitely there was heavy inclination to reconstruct interior spaces as kind of world interiors. If you think of all of corporate spaces in Google headquarters or Foster headquarters, it was the construction of an interior world. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it lays ground for asking more questions.
I think the question of the pandemic, which is a, the prevalent subject today, one that I try to avoid most of the time and delete all the news, because there, as it said, one of the titles today, people talk, but they don't do. So, and that's a reality. I think the problem, of course, there's been, you read history, there's been the plague, there's been all kinds, and they're rated actually how lethal they have been historically, each one of them compared to now. There are two major differences. First, the growth of population, as have been logarithmic, systematically. The growth of population in urban centers, the movement, which is constant, of people, the global movement, which is constant, which actually allowed for this particular case not to be contained initially because people were traveling and so on, in very, what's going to China now? Nothing, So I think the conditions have changed. The problem is that what does illness mean in the structures of power? What is the control of sickness and illness and the structure of health systems mean to the structures of power? And that's where we have a problem. Because the question of control of pandemics or epidemics, they have been controlled in the past before vaccines existed. Then there were the vaccines, we forget. I remember as a child, when there was polio, we were scared stiff that you didn't get polio. And then when there was a vaccine, it was like breathing, finally, But people were more contained. They were not, they were not moving constantly from end of the world to the other. And maybe health had a more prevalent place. The health of a social health had a more prevalent place in the structures of political power. Maybe they were more naive. Maybe they thought it was important as opposed to, this extreme of capitalist economy that we have now, where bodies can be spared. Oh, 250,000 died? Well, that's not so bad, even if it's more than all the wars we've had. Well, after all, if we think of how many people are making money and what is it, and then the social implications of who dies and who doesn't die. So I think when you talk about the pandemic in the context of what we do in our environment, I think all these questions are bear to be thought about. It is a political issue. I agree with Lydia about, the importance of, our biological making and the environmental conditions that can foster or prevent sickness, disease, et cetera. But they don't exist in a vacuum. Someone has plans for this or that. We can see it firsthand here. This pandemic, the state of this pandemic in the US could have been avoided totally. People have written exactly how, and we have the tools, but somebody decided not to. So I think you can't, and the environmental has an impact too. And people, because people can't stay confinement. Everybody moves too much. Doesn't matter that we have all the tools to communicate. Imagine when you didn't have Zoom and you didn't have telephone, and you didn't have all of these, and you have a pandemic or an epidemic. What are you going to do? Lock yourself in the bathroom and look at the wall? I mean, it is an issue. So in a certain way, you know, we are privileged to live in a time where, despite the pandemic, we can still talk to each other and have this interesting conversation about the body, you know, but you have to think about what illness means, not as metaphor, but illness and the institutions that deal with it and the structures of power, economic and political, that allow things to happen or not to happen. And if we talk about the body, I could move on to how much money is invested in this research that affects for disease, for cures, that affects female bodies, then the amount of money that's put into the research for disease that affects male bodies. And the distance is gigantic. And I didn't make that one up. It's not a metaphor, it is a fact. So, you know, we have to take this, I think, in context while we look at it. When you get into questions of illness and of health, I think there's a whole social structure that is at play. And I think we should face it if we're interested in it. And, you know, it's not just the body itself. Our bodies are so fragile, you know. I had a paragraph about how to describe the body, which I think is very funny, but I eliminated it from this presentation, you know. But, you know, it's a very inefficient, you know, system and very fragile, our little bodies. So, and we were born, life was born out of bacteria after all. So what can we expect? A lot of things to think about.
I look forward to the time when we can make space corporeal again and have real lectures together. But if there are no questions, I think this is a good time to wrap it up. People have curfews and classes. But I'd like to thank both presenters for their wonderful comments, thinking, provocative questions, and thank you for the audience for the wonderful comments and attention. So thank you, everybody. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having us. And
Thank you.
I just want to say in closing that I miss your bodies and the lobby and the school. And I hope we can all be together as bodies soon.
So do I. And I really thank everybody for being here and the students for inviting us. And in my extraordinary pleasure and privilege to have a conversation with Lydia, always.
Oh my God, the honor is mine. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.